Hello and welcome to this month's webinar. This month's webinar is Communicating in Multi-Generational Teams. My name is Danette Finton-Menzies and I'm the Director of Learning at Magical Learning. And welcome to this month's free webinar. Now today what we're going to cover is a number of different things around leading multi-generational teams. So firstly, what are the different generations, the definitions of them, and what are their characteristics in terms of being in teams? Then we're going to look at how do you communicate and inspire the different generations in your team, and finally discuss some of the strategies and tools to promote greater respect and teamwork between the different generations. I always love quotes. I love this one. Talent is a gift, but your attitude, work ethic and character are things that you have to develop yourself. So true. Now, working in or looking at the different generations, starting at the youngest, we have Gen Z. They're sometimes called the iGen because they're brought up with all things iPhone, iPad, etc. Or they're sometimes called the Centennials as well. They're generally born from 1996 and later. Our Millennials or Gen Ys are born from 1977 to 1996. Gen X's, of which I'm one, are born from 1965 to 1976. And our baby boomers are born from 1946 to 1964. And there is also the traditionalists. So there are still some traditionalists in the workplace, and they're also called the silent generation, and they were born from 1945 and earlier. So they've often come out of, whether it's either the Depression, it's certainly the Second World War. So they knew times where there wasn't a lot of resources and a lot of jobs, etc. Now, in terms of statistics of what percentage of these generations are in the workplace, based on the Bureau of Stats 2014 figures, Gen Z's, in terms of our overall population, are about 26.2%. The Millennials and Gen X, because they combine them, are about 28%, and our baby boomers currently are about 23.7% in the workplace. Now, some interesting shifts are going to happen over the next little while. So by 2025, millennials globally will comprise 3/4 of the global workforce. So that's a massive shift. The other thing is, what we're expecting is how our population actually looks. So here in Australia, currently the percentage of the population that's 15 years or younger is about 20%. By 2051, that is expected to decrease by or down to 14%. However, what we're going to see is the percentage of the population that is 65 plus years will double over that period. So currently it's about 14% of our population here in Australia, but by 2051 it'll be 28% of the population. So we're going to have massive demands for support for the older generations and less younger generations coming into the workplace. So that means that's going to create challenges for specific workplaces in terms of attracting and also retaining the younger generation. Now let's look at some of the characteristics for the different generations. So starting with the traditionalists, they were brought up in a time where you followed the rules. So they're very much loyal to an employer. They often will have worked with the one employer for their whole life. They were definitely brought up that hard work needs to come first. So hard work was also always before pleasure, which means that if on Friday afternoon something needs to be completed, they would stay back and do that versus going off for a social engagement. When the baby boomers started to come into the workplace, they grew up as part of the generation that protested what government was doing and things like that. So they were very much focused on things like equal rights, equal opportunity. They tend to be more team orientated, and I found a thing that said that they trust no one over 30. I don't think that's generally always true, but they're very much a generation that put work before pleasure and personal stuff. So what you tend to find is that they would go to work, and they often raised what was called the latchkey kids, because they'd work and the kids would be at home, and that was just the way things were. Nowadays, obviously, that's wouldn't happen so much. Then we have our Gen X's. So they very much grew up in a time where unemployment was high, interest rates were high, their parents were often losing their jobs. So they are less likely to be loyal to a particular organisation. They very much value work-life balance, with the focus on life balance as well. They are highly educated, and they tend to be quite entrepreneurial because they wouldn't necessarily rely just on one employer. They knew that they needed to look after themselves. They tend to be quite technologically literate, but not technologically extremely savvy. My Gen Ys do tend to be quite achievement orientated. They do focus also on the impact they have on society and the environment, so they have a high civic duty as well. They're the first generation that was really global centric, and they are generally the most educated generation as well. They are good at balancing work life, and they are very much now focused. They do love cool experiences and are extremely techno savvy. For them, technology is really important. So as a workplace, we need to be really mindful that our technology is up to date. If it's really old and out of date, you'll tend to find that they will disengage around that. This generation, and also the Gen Zs, much more about fun. Certainly social connection, training is important for them, personal development, achieving greater fulfillment, and obviously focusing on having great culture in the workplace, being an organisation that leaves a small or no imprint from an environmental perspective, and offering them the opportunity to have varied job roles. So they like a job that is about the opportunities. So it has to be, it has to have variety, it has to have flexibility. The other thing is, if you look at both the Gen X and Gen Y and Gen Z, they tend to prefer flatter structures because that gives them more of an opportunity to try different things. With my Gen Zs, they've grown up with parents who are often very entrepreneurial, and so they are quite interested in different businesses, different ideas. They will be innovative, and they live connected to technology. So they are hooked on technology, which means they're always on, and they, again, prefer those. Whereas the Ys prefer the cool experiences, my Zs prefer the cool products because they've grown up with all these amazing technological products. For both of those, particularly the Gen Y, I would say, some of the other things we need to consider as employers are that they're starting to have children. So things like childcare, being flexible, offering things like parental leave will be important for the Gen Ys, and as the Gen Zs start to have children, the same sort of idea. In terms of attributes, our traditionalists, because they generally had one employer for life, are very much committed to the company. They will work really hard, and they tend to be task orientated. They very much adhere to the hierarchy, and they give authority to those that are higher up based on the fact that they are higher up in the work structure. My baby boomers are good at handling crisis, but they tend to be quite competitive. They will be good at multitasking and quite happy to take on responsibilities. They will challenge authority, which can cause some tension sometimes with the traditionalists, and they do have a strong work ethic because, remember, they put work over personal. This is different from the Gen X's. So Gen X's tend to be adaptable because they're quite entrepreneurial. They will crave independence, and their focus will be much more on the results. In a workplace, if they've got a good manager, then they will stay because they are loyal to the manager. If the manager isn't good, they will tend to leave pretty quickly. They like to take on responsibility. However, they are often unimpressed with authority. My Gen Ys are ambitious, but because of technology, not always entirely focused. They do, because of the way they were brought up in schooling, they do like working in teams. They are, however, fiercely independent, and they think quite globally, which is really lovely. Instead of being loyal to the manager, they're actually loyal to the peers, and they want responsibility early on in their life. So because of the way they were brought up at school, that responsibility is something they're quite happy to take on earlier rather than later. So if you've got a system that's based on how long a person has worked in your organisation and that's how they get promoted, you'll probably find your Gen Ys disengaging pretty quickly. Now, my Zs are quite pragmatic and they strive for success. They are very much focused on social change, so they will connect with organisations that not only are focused on making money, but also the impact they have on from a society or an environmental perspective. They like transparency, so where things aren't transparent, where it's not authentic, again, they'll disengage. And here they really value being mentored, both mentored by someone perhaps from an older generation, but they also are quite happy to mentor older generations by sharing their skills from technology, social media, etc. This generation, as well as the Gen Ys, need regular feedback, and they like clear career goals. They want to know what's the next step, what they need to be working on. And so that means investing in them, mentoring, coaching them, and also giving them a clear guide in terms of how they're going to get trained and grown. In terms of work, our traditionalists obviously will be hard workers, task-orientated, and very much see age as equaling seniority, which equals for them respect. My baby boomers tend to be workaholics, and they will focus on both the relationships but also achieving results. Different from the X's, because the X's are very much more about having work-life balance, and they're very much more task and results orientated. My Gen Ys are ambitious, but they want to know what's coming next, what's next, what's next. They want to keep growing. And they're more global and network focused. And finally, my Zs, they value that opportunity to grow. They like technology. They want to work individually. However, they want to connect with their peers so that they've got that stimulation. So in terms of what are some of the challenges in your workplace around the different generations? So some of the challenges I see are the different generations not understanding each other, not valuing what the generations bring, not being able to communicate well with one another because of particular biases, for argument's sake. Sometimes it is also that they don't know how to work with one another. Technology can be a challenge. Sometimes also just attention. So, because of technology, people get distracted quite a lot. As Jan said here too, also understanding, the value that the different generations bring. So younger generation valuing the knowledge that the older generations have, for argument's sake. Now, I love quotes, and this one I really love. The older generation thought nothing of getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and the younger generation doesn't think so much of it either. I actually think that's a great quote. Most people don't like 5 o'clock, except for me. I like 5 o'clock. Now, in terms of communication, each generation is slightly different, and it's based on the media that they grew up with. So let's start with the traditionalists first, or the silent generation. They were brought up in the days when letters were sent and handwritten notes, and most of the communication took place face to face. So they tend to still prefer those forms of communication because that's how they were brought up with. So their preferences are more auditory and more visual. When the baby boomers started growing up, they were exposed more to radio and the telephone. So their preference is more for face-to-face talking. They also quite like emails as well. But when you communicate with them, think in terms of words and think in terms of auditory, that they need to hear things. My Gen X are different because when they were born, TV was just starting. So they think much more in terms of pictures, which is a much more visual preference because that's what they grew up with, which means that they tend to prefer emails. My millennials or Gen Ys, We'll prefer, if it's an important message, that it's done face-to-face. Otherwise, because they've grown up with technology, so they're very tactile or kinesthetic, they would prefer to receive things in electronic form, so emails or text, for argument's sake. We need to make sure when we're communicating with them that we are transparent, that there is detail in what we're talking about, there's structure, and ask their opinion. And it's about the actions that they need to take. My Gen Zs prefer traditional communication methods. They've often been raised a little bit by different generations because they've grown up with lots of technology, short and sharp, and obviously sending it through technology is good for them as well. I'm just going to turn so I'm going to sneeze. All right, back again after the sneeze. Now, obviously, in any workplace, communication is critical. So it is important, if we want to grow our leadership skills, is to make sure that we communicate in a way that makes the other person feel valued. It doesn't matter what their generation is, they need to feel valued. So some of the things we can do is be curious, get to know the person, get to understand what are their individual preferences in terms of communication. And one of the great things or tools we can use is to ask questions. By asking questions, we show that we're interested in them and we are more likely to create trust and therefore engagement. If you find that you tend to interrupt when someone is replying to a question you've asked, try the WAIT principle. And this comes from coaching, and WAIT stands for why am I talking? So as the person is responding, metaphorically or whatever the word is, bite your tongue and let them have their say and listen. Another thing that is important is make sure, as of the previous slide, that we tend to use their preferences in terms of communication. So we adapt our style to them to make them feel valued. And who doesn't want to feel valued and acknowledged in the workplace? Now, in terms of strategies that can help create greater respect within a team, is get your team together and get them to think about, well, what is the vision for our team? What are the values? What are the rules we need to have so that we can honour and respect one another? As a coach, one of the things I find is the word respect means a different thing for pretty much every single individual. So when we make it overt by actually asking the team, what does respect look like for you, we're able to be more mindful of what respect looks like for each team member. It is really easy, if we don't do this, to judge a person and think that they're not respecting you based on your definition of respect, which could be entirely different to their definition of respect. So by sharing who we are, what are the characteristics of our generation, what are our preferences, this can help us to start to honour and respect one another in the workplace. Another thing that's quite helpful for helping you to understand individual team members is to do a team-based assessment and look at how people perhaps like to work or what the individual characteristics of team members are. One of the tools we use is Team Management Profile, and what it does, or TMP, and what it does is basically look at individuals and their work preferences, and that's really helpful for people understanding who should be doing what tasks in a team, but also why some people are stronger in particular areas than others. One thing we know for certain is that our brain is hardwired to see anyone who we don't really know as a foe rather than a friend. One of the ways we can counteract this and create more cohesion in an organisational team is to look for similarities. So rather than going, that person is a Gen whatever, and that's different from me, a better approach would be, I wonder what sort of areas we would both enjoy. So something like food, for argument's sake. For example, Jan loves cooking and food. Most people love food. There's a great way to connect with others in order to be able to see those similarities rather than looking for the differences. When we see each other as similar, we trust each other better, we work together better. It's really important to listen to others so that we get to know them better, and look for ways that each generation can learn off each other. There's a concept called reverse mentoring, where younger generations will mentor older generations around areas such as technology and social media. That's a great way of getting the best out of the different generations. And obviously, my older generations have skills, they have knowledge that the younger generation can also benefit from. So there's some examples of ways that you can create great teams. Some other tools are obviously teaching each team member the different communication preferences so that everyone gets to understand how to communicate better to each other. Also helping people to recognise that they often will stereotype people. So we will stereotype the generations, for argument's sake. And when we stereotype, we stop seeing the individual because our brain is quite lazy. It wants to use a stereotype to go, okay, here you go, I don't have to think too hard. The problem is when we stereotype, it obviously creates problems. For example, we had a student who worked for a manager who had a particular stereotype about the student's cultural background, and so the manager was particularly poor at dealing with that particular student, wouldn't give them work because of their stereotype, which said that that particular culture was lazy, etc. Now that's not good, and that's obviously something we would not promote in terms of good leadership. Another thing is to learn about unconscious bias. We all have particular bias that we're unconscious about, and the problem is it plays out in how we interact with others. So I'm going to give you a dilemma and then see if you can come up with the answer to the dilemma. So this dilemma is: a father and his son are involved in a horrific car crash. A man died at the scene. But when the child arrived at the hospital and was rushed into the operating theatre, the surgeon pulled away and said, "I can't operate on this boy, he's my son." Now, how can that be? What do you think the answer is? And this is one that often stumps people. So the answer is that the surgeon is the boy's mother. Now, many people associate surgeon with male or the father, and that's a completely unconscious bias. And it's so obvious once I tell you the answer, but a lot of people grapple with how could that be because the father died. So there's an example of unconscious bias. So learning more about where you might show unconscious bias can help you counteract that bias. Really important, we all like to be seen as individuals. So it is so important to treat every single person as an individual. Yes, they are from a particular generation, and most importantly, they are an individual. Some of the ways we can also support growth in every single generation is to provide coaching. So whether it's the younger generation coaching the older generation, getting external coaches, or the manager coaching someone, all of that helps people grow. The other thing is to encourage the different generations to mentor one another. And I really like that concept of reverse mentoring. So acknowledging that our younger generation are much better at things like technology and social media and learning from them. The other thing that I think works beautifully is where we structure a team so it does include the different generations. So obviously support the team so that they set their values, their visions, etc. Give them training about how everyone is different, and then supporting them to communicate and work really well together. One of the best groups I ever had when I was teaching very early in my career was a group where one of the team members was in their 70s and the youngest team member was about 18. And that group over the year, because I had them for a year-long diploma, went from not really knowing each other through to the end of the year being the most vibrant group, because they not only got to know each other really well, but they valued what each team member brought, and that created an amazing group of learners and a pleasure to see. So when we get it right, we create an environment where everyone thrives and feels valued. Now, the next bit I really love, and this is he or she plants trees to benefit another generation. And really, this is what we do as we get older. I see coaching and mentoring the younger generation as really important because we're growing the next generation, and that is so, so important. Well, it is for me anyway. Now, I'm curious as to what you're going to work on in terms of leading multi-generational teams moving forward. Okay, so some of you are going to take that time to learn a little bit more about the different generations, get to understand them, their idiosyncrasies, put in place reverse mentoring so that we can learn off one another, share the differences. Great. All great opportunities there. Now, we've also provided a number of different resources that can help. So if you're interested in reverse mentoring, there's a YouTube video there. The TEDx talk is fabulous in terms of explaining how the different generations were raised, what they were raised on, and how it impacts who they are. It helps with the understanding. Really like the Harvard Business Review article because it talks about managing people from those 5 generations and helping to understand how you get the best out of each of them. And a number of those differences, or the attributes I showed you of the different generations, came from the generational differences chart that I've given you the PDF there. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Jan, about organisations training younger managers to get more out of their older generation and understanding them. And that's obviously going to be a shift that we see in the workplace, so it will definitely be an area that I would imagine trainers start to focus on in the not too distant future, and we're certainly looking at that at the moment. Okay, it doesn't look like we've got any other questions. Now, just a reminder that next month we're going to be looking at you as a world-class leader. That will be on Thursday the 13th of September at 10:30 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. That particular one will be giving you particular strategies on how you can grow your leadership skills. So I hope you can join us for next month as well. Hope this has been valuable and have a great magical day. Thank you.